Interestingly enough, last week I'd already chosen to do an exhort, and it was actually on to keeping our faith in times where COVID seems to have pretty much just paused our lives, and then looking at some of the examples in Bible history where there was some seeming periods, like in Jeremiah's time, where God actually did a whole lot of things underneath, I guess, seemingly what history tells us, and that life and God's plans are still happening, even though, we feel sometimes that our life's on hold. But then we have the incident, obviously, of Putin coming into the Ukraine, and so I've chosen a different one to talk about, which was looking at the life of Joseph, and particularly looking at providence and trust, and how God uses events, and how we can actually trust that God will bring about his plan. And just as Brother David has been talking about this morning, it does feel, I guess, like the world is in chaos. So I guess to most people, they would be feeling that way. And what we're going to look at is essentially God's plan. Everything is in control of God's plan. He's in control of it all. So front and center, we have Putin's actions this morning in the Ukraine, and the might that we see of the Russian power. Interestingly, also is the reactions that we sort of see from the Western world, particularly America, quite standoffish, I guess, at this stage, in regards to not fully really wanting to resist. Resistance is at this stage words and I guess some financial stuff, but there's no real sort of real strong backing behind it. And I think in the past I'd always wondered when we looked at some of the quotes around, I guess, Gogian powers coming down. I always wondered how we had this question. So, Russia's come all the way down in the Middle East. And then we get this question. It's like, have you come down for a spoil? And you're like, well, we've traveled 3,000 kilometers. Like, why are you asking the question now? But I think some of the reactions that you see is a real reluctance in the world to enter into any type of confrontation with Russia. And they are a mighty power. So at the moment, the reluctance is essentially they've drawn a line, and the line is if you cross this into a NATO-friendly country, then we'll react. So we've got a line now currently around the NATO countries. Interestingly enough, there's a whole lot of countries in that area that aren't NATO. Well, I guess we don't really know what ends up happening with those countries. Also, the way he's done it, how blatant Putin has done it. So, saying I'm not doing something and then plainly doing exactly what he was saying he wasn't doing. And then even just recently, so the claims a couple of nights ago were essentially around he was coming in to recognise the independence of some Republican states. So down towards the southeast of Ukraine, really nowhere near Kiev where they're attacking, but that's the claim, and the claim also comes around the fact that he's actually following a United Nations charter in order to do that work. So he's tried to put some, I guess, legal spin around validating his actions because of the Ukrainian government have been abusing these people for a long time. So as Brother David said, it's saddened, but it's also very exciting times for a Bible student. So by way of exhortation this morning, we're going to look at the providence of God through the life of Joseph. And it's a really good story to look at providence when we look at the story of Joseph. We can clearly see this in the example of his life. So we're going to look at the example, essentially, of looking for God in our lives. Now, I don't know if you're aware of this, but Moses in Genesis allows more airtime for Joseph than any other character mentioned in there. And there's some very prominent characters in the book of Genesis: Adam, Eve, Noah, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Yet Joseph's story actually takes up 14 chapters, from Genesis 37 through to Genesis 50. So it wasn't something I immediately recognized. And I think this airtime's even stranger when you see how little Joseph is mentioned outside of this Genesis record. So the story of Joseph continues, I guess, the Genesis narrative, which Joseph's story is highlighting how God's providence is going to go and secure his promises that he's made. And so all through Genesis, we have these threats around the survival and the purity of, I guess, the Abraham line, the covenant line at this time. And we know the circumstances around the family at this time and Jacob's family. All this situations is quite dire, I guess, for the continuation of this covenant line. There's massive family division and violence. We know that sort of started with Cain and Abel. There's unrighteousness. There's intermarriage with foreign nations. And then, of course, they're in this global famine. And this is all coming to threaten the survival of this covenant line, this seed of Eve. And they all seem to converge in this story of Joseph. And we see from his reactions how he ends up resolving these problems that are within his family. Instead of exacting revenge on his brothers for their actions, he reconciles with them and he brings and restores unity back to the family. And then afterwards, Joseph settles in Goshen. He's done that because he wanted to shield them from the influence of the Egyptians whilst they continue to grow into this nation of Israel. And then, of course, he does this while he's preserving them through a 7-year famine. Now, quite often in the Bible, there is a verse that sums up the life or the character of an individual. And one of the very few references to Joseph in the New Testament is during Stephen's speech in Acts 7, verse 9. And he says, "And the patriarchs, jealous of Joseph, sold him into Egypt, but God was with him." So the phrase that sums up Joseph's life is that God was with him. Despite all the trials of his life, God was with him. And when you look at the summary, I guess, of Joseph's life, it's obvious. The little hated boy who ends up the second most powerful person in Egypt. But as you're living this story out day by day, as Joseph was, it would have been so easy for him to believe that God had abandoned him. A person who went through so many ups and downs, times in his life when he must have really struggled to see God in his life. Situations don't get any worse than being sold into slavery by your brothers. And then he also suffers the tragedy of being jailed for a crime that he doesn't commit. And each time he seems to make the best out of the circumstances that are dealt to him. He's the head of Potiphar's house. He's the chief in the prison. And each time he seems to come crashing down through no fault of his own. Now, we know the story of Joseph very well about being sold into slavery by his brothers. And that was because they were extremely jealous of him. He was clearly Jacob's favourite, and he was wearing a cloak to highlight to everyone that he was the favourite. He's born of a different mother from the brothers, and that mother was the favourite wife of Jacob. And then his job is being sent to report on his brother's activities by Jacob, and he comes back with a bad report to his father. And it says that his brothers hated him. They couldn't speak peaceably to him. And then it's made worse by these dreams that he begins to tell them. And these dreams, his brothers, they're bowing down to him. And so this is when they hatch their plan to get rid of him. And so then we have another verse which encapsulates the story of Joseph in verse 20, which was read from Genesis 50. And it says, "As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, in order to bring about this present result to preserve many people alive." So the phrase, "You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good." And this introduces a characteristic or an attribute of God, which we often call his providence. The way in which God brings about his end, brings about his will. No matter what the intention of the people at that time, whether it's good or bad, or what the circumstances of life, God will still bring about his ultimate end. And we know whatever God means to happen will ultimately happen. So God coordinates and organises all these apparently independent activities, thoughts and ideas and movements of people, pulls them all together, harmonise them to the stage that he will bring about his ultimate end. And we see many examples of this revealed to us in the Bible, but none more dramatic than this story of Joseph. So as we come to this 50th chapter of the book of Genesis, we see that Jacob's just died. And so now his brothers are very anxious regarding what Joseph's going to do them because of the evil that they had done to him previously. So at the story, as it began, we had Joseph as a teenager, but now he's well over 100 years old. So life's come full circle, and he's sitting there addressing these two-faced brothers of his. Their actions of selling him into slavery had nothing but evil intent written all over them. And their evil was no way lessened by the knowledge that things didn't turn out as they might have actually thought. The truth is that God overruled their evil actions to accomplish a purpose that neither they nor Joseph could even have fathomed. God brought good out of their evil. And this got accomplished through a variety of actions. Joseph's descent into slavery, followed by a false accusation of rape, resulting in a lengthy imprisonment, and that spelled this downward spiral of Joseph's life to the bottom. His life could hardly have been worse. And only from the advantage point of what God had in fact accomplished, ensuring that an heir of the covenant promises was actually in the most powerful position of Egypt at a time when Canaan was suffering such a devastating famine, to ensure the survival of this covenant family. Could Joseph look back at his life and see the hand of God? And it's said that providence is probably best understood or read like Hebrew, which is backwards. Only then is it possible to see traces of the divine hand in action. And his hand was always in control. Providence has wider issues in mind than merely our personal comfort or our gain. In answer to common questions in times of difficulty, it might be, why me? And the answer is often them. Sometimes we go through experiences or we suffer just as Joseph did in order to, I guess, preserve his undeserving brothers. In their case, he's meant by being kept alive during the famine and having the covenant promises of their father, their grandfather, and their great-grandfather reaffirmed before their very eyes. So what do you think went through the minds of those disciples who carried the blood-soaked body of Stephen for his burial? Were they saying, what a waste? Couldn't God have spared this godly man so that he might be of some use in the ecclesia, in their very necessary time of need? They'd be thinking, does God care about us at all? And in all these questions, we would see the short-sightedness of them that we all suffer from. The fact that we live in the present. We don't have the ability to see any good that can come from a circumstance like this. And then, at the feet of Stephen's corpse, stood a man whom Stephen's death had the most profound impact. When he heard the voice of Jesus speak to him and accuse him of persecuting God's Messiah. And Paul learned what is arguably his most characteristic feature, is that every disciple is in such spiritual worth with Christ that to persecute one of them, one of the little ones, is the same as persecuting Jesus himself. So back to the story of Joseph. His brothers in verse 15 saw that his father was dead. And they said that in verse 15, it may be that Joseph will hate us and pay us back for all the evil that we did to them. And we can picture this, the 11 faces grimly staring at the floor as there was Joseph, huddled before one of the most powerful rulers of the world. And he has the authority to execute them. But Joseph looks down on these humble Jewish herdsmen, and as they stooped before him, and he's got a long history with these men, and the history is full of pain and full of suffering and rejection. And the memories would still be very vividly etched into his mind. And so the question that is posed is, what action is Joseph going to take? His father, Jacob, is dead. They'd already buried him, and now they're here to beg for mercy. So perhaps they'd already voiced this to Jacob before he died, because Jacob in verse 16 was uttering the words, your father gave this command before he died. It says in verse 16, say to Joseph, please forgive the transgression of your brothers for their sin, because they did evil to you. And now, please forgive the transgression of the servants of the God of your father. So they're really worried about this reaction from Joseph. They're frightened because they wonder, now that their dad is dead, if Joseph is finally going to enact revenge. I don't know, had he been just waiting for Jacob to die before he enacted his revenge? And this story comes out quite quickly in the Bible, but you can imagine the brothers agonizing over this for months. Could be even years, wondering when Joseph was going to enact his revenge. And as they're seeing Jacob getting older and older, they're wondering if he's going to bide, if he's just biding his time. And this would have been time for them to all continually remember about their involvement in selling their brother. And we know Reuben, the oldest, had blamed himself for what had happened to Joseph, and Judah felt a heavy burden and stinging weight of guilt because he was the one who initially suggested Joseph be sold into slavery. But it's all the brothers, all of them except Benjamin. All of them had been involved and they were all guilty. But instead, this silence, when it's broken, it turns out not anger. It turns out to be not hostility. It's not threats. It's not even statements of harsh punishment to come, but rather it was crying, it was weeping. And one by one, you could imagine these brothers lifting their heads and looking into the eyes of Joseph as he looks back with a forgiving smile, with tears tumbling down his face. And his tears obviously show to be contagious as they all begin to weep. And so the words that Joseph says in verse 19 to 20 is, "Do not be afraid, for I in the place of God, but as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, in order to bring it about as it is this day, to save many people alive. Now therefore, do not be afraid. I'll provide for you and your little ones." And he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. There was no vengeance. There was no hatred. There was no animosity. He treats his brothers with mercy. He treats them with loving kindness. He treats them with undeserved favour. And from this story, the question we'd like to explore further is, how does someone display such kindness, such love and mercy after being treated so wickedly? How does this attitude of complete forgiveness and passion come out of the heart of someone who is so horribly treated? And the answer is found in Joseph's spirituality. He has this clear understanding that what his brothers had done to him is evil, and they meant it for evil, but that God meant it for good. He had a clear understanding that God was at work, that God was in control, and that you can trust God for an outcome. And you can see that early in the record when Joseph's talking to his brothers to talk to Jacob. It would have been easy for them to look at the circumstances that happened and place blame either on his brothers or on God. And likewise, it would have been just as easy for Joseph to take credit for working his way up through the prison to a place of position and power. But he doesn't. Joseph recognises that it was not the working of his brothers selling him into slavery, and it was not his own doing that elevated him into a place of status. It was the hand of God working purposely in all things to bring about his will. In Genesis 45, it says, as he arose to second power under Pharaoh, it says, "And do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life." God had a plan for the world. And in order to bring about that plan, he had a plan for Israel. And in order to bring about that plan for Israel, he had a plan for Joseph. It was all tied together. The plan for his chosen people included survival through this 7-year famine. During the 7-year famine, they had no food in Israel. That brought them to Egypt, where there was plenty of food. And they arrived in Egypt because of this greatness of Joseph. They were given land of their own, the best land in Goshen. And then over the next 4 centuries, they formed a group. They transformed from a family into a nation. And this nation was to witness the glory of God. And this was all part of God's plan to fulfill his covenant promises of a seed and salvation that would extend to the whole earth that he'd promised earlier to their great-grandfather Abraham. God was making all things work together for the good of accomplishing his great plan. God intended the trials of this very unlikely hero that would be for the good of his family, for the good of the nation that would come out of the family, and through the nation, the good of the world. Joseph suffered. He suffered repeatedly in his life. And he didn't suffer because God was punishing him for sin, but he did suffer so that God could ultimately save sinners. There had to be a nation of Israel, so that out of the nation of Israel would come this Messiah, who would be the only saviour that the world would ever need. So his circumstances seems completely unfair. But God, by the evil deeds of others, which God does not condone, has Joseph exactly where he wants him. The Lord is completely in control, and the Lord doesn't do evil. The Lord doesn't condone evil. The Lord isn't in the evil, but he uses evil. So we all go through circumstances and trials in life that are far from ideal. And we need to focus on the life of Joseph to get an appreciation of God working in our lives. We need to understand what is good for us may not be good for the overall plan of God. And God has to bring about his purpose. But he'll bring about his purpose. We need to constantly reflect, on our lives, to see God working in them, to see the good which will come out of the hand of God. So as we focus on the memorials this morning, the links between Joseph and Jesus are unmistakable. Being betrayed for the price of a slave, falsely accused, bound in chains and condemned with criminals. But no better link than he was one man suffering to bring about the salvation of the nation of Israel. Joseph through the famine, and Jesus as the perfect sacrifice that takes away the sins of the world. They forgave those who wronged them and saved them from certain death. Joseph's story is the story of the whole Bible. It's the story of glory through suffering, of exaltation through humiliation. It's the story of the cross and the crown. Whatever evil man did to them, God turned it into good, and God was with them. Thanks.